Always takes a second to do this. And okay, so while we're just waiting for people to come, because like literally, so we're live now, but it'll take a second for people to come on. So I will ask you some questions first, and then I'll do like the kind of the formal introduction once I start to see people that are getting on. So there's one person that is there already. So Dr.
Okay.
Clark,
Yes.
name two interesting people that you've met.
Two interesting people.
Uh-huh.
The ones that come to mind would be Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa. Yeah.
So how did you get to meet them?
Do you want me to tell the story now or when the audience comes on?
There's one person here that can hear the story.
Oh.
The early bird gets the worm. There's two people here, so they get to hear the story. Okay, so I'll jump in and start. Okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade. I'm the executive director at A Healing Paradigm, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia, but we are virtual every Friday. I am bringing my colleagues from across the globe, having this conversation about the intersections for me that I think are important in terms of Western psychology, African spiritual traditions, indigenous healing, culture, and spirituality, and looking at all the aspects of the African diaspora. And so today I'm excited to have my guest, who is Dr. Sulaiman Clark, who has, I like to tease and say he's done a lot of stuff. I asked him earlier, like, what have you not done? Who is a brilliant scholar, and I'm always impressed. He is an author. He has done a lot of stuff. Dr. Clark has a doctorate from Harvard University in educational planning, administration, and social policy. Today, he is blessed me for us to be able to have this dialogue. Today, we're going to talk about specifically working with the Black community and working with the Black community from a particular perspective. So before I say any more, I want to thank my guests for coming. Hey, Dr. Clark, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
I know that you said one time, I was listening to you talk, and you were talking about leadership, and you said this concept of servant leadership. And I had never heard that term before. And I was so impressed. And so that's part of the conversation that we're going to have today. But before we jump in, because there are people that are listening, I want to get back to, so you said you had two interesting people, Nelson Mandela, and then I forgot the second person's name.
Mother Teresa of India.
Mother Teresa. Okay,
Yeah.
so and you've met both of them. So tell me, how did you get to meet the two of them?
Well, this goes back to the early 1990s when I was fortunate enough to get a Kellogg Fellowship. This fellowship was focused on new and emerging leaders, and you had the opportunity to design a 3-year program for yourself that addressed some academic and personal interests that you had. So my interest was in servant leadership. So I used those 2 years traveling, principally in Asia and Africa, speaking with so-called servant leaders who I knew of by reputation, but obviously did not know them personally. Mm-hmm. So in the course of that 3-year program, I had the opportunity to meet servant leaders, some of whom you know, are household names, some that you would never know. But the ones, as you were saying, as I was saying to you earlier, that stick out of my mind really are Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa, because of what happened at the interviews and what I learned, what I did not anticipate I would learn.
Okay, and we're definitely going to jump into that, because this is a topic, and I have to credit you. This is a topic that I'm very interested in. Good. And you were the one that helped me to be able to realize that this is even a concept. How did you get into servant leadership? Like, how was your interest sparked in that particular area?
I'll say this has been something close to a 40-year journey, trying to understand the theory and practice of servant leadership. But as it happened, I was just in my first year of graduate school, and I'm in the library, and I'm walking along looking at books, and most of the books were brown, black covers, and there was this green covered book that drew my eye, and thick in the spine, and there was thick lettering that said servant leadership. So I just gravitated to it. And lo and behold, it was Robert K. Greenleaf's seminal book entitled Servant Leadership. And I started to read it, and fell in love with it. I would carry it with me wherever I go. When we were in high school, we used to talk about the Mal was carrying a little red book.
Uh-huh.
You'd see me with my little green book. And Greenleaf is the one who turned me on to this concept. But lo and behold, and I'll say more about this later if we have time, this concept of servant leadership is ancient. It's as old as man, and it's deeply rooted in most of our great religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like buried, and there's no reason for it to be buried because there's power there. And that's what I've been studying.
Okay.
The power of the word and how it manifests in society.
So, for people that haven't heard the concept, just define it for us. What is a servant leader?
So it's kind of funny. When you think about servant leader, it's almost like an oxymoron, like two words that don't belong together, like Biggie Smalls
Yeah.
or Bob and Mary's First National Bank.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense. So the concept is a simple one. The idea is that many of us strive to be leaders. And frankly, given the choice between being a servant and a leader, most of us would say, hey, I'd like to be a leader.
A leader, yeah.
The word servant kind of trips up a lot of people because they think of servitude, which is something we don't want. And particularly Black folks, like, no, I'll pass on that. I had enough of servitude. So the word servant can be a turnoff if it's not properly understood. But the idea is a simple one. The idea is that a servant leader is someone who wants to enrich and empower others, as opposed to a leader who just wants to hold sway and govern over others. That's the distinction. And there's power in those two words. I think of servant leader as sort of like a numerator denominator.
Mm-hmm.
So in most people's mind, the numerator is leader, and under the leader is a servant. So what I'm trying to do in my writing is invert that, flip that, and say that the top is servant and at the bottom is leader, because it's what you want to do with and for others that makes you a dynamic servant leader and distinguishes you from, I dare say, the majority of leaders that we have today.
Okay, so let's break this down. Okay, so this is
Yeah.
Black people talking. Okay, so let's throw out some examples
Sure.
of servant leaders and the antithesis of a servant leader.
Sure.
That people might know today. Like, what would be some examples?
Oh,
Are any guys?
it pains me, but since you asked, I think about someone like a Donald Trump, who is all about self, unabashedly so. You can see him coming 10,000 miles away. He announces himself every day, just the way he conducts himself, the things he says, the policies that he promotes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Versus, say, a John Lewis. That'd be a good example here in Atlanta, who's from college said about that he was going to affect social change for the benefit of his people. So everything he does lines up with that singular goal. It's not about promoting John Lewis. It's about promoting Black folks.
Okay.
To me, that's a vivid contrast.
Okay. I mean, and that makes sense. And I wonder about this, like, as a parent, like, so you and I are parents.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking to our children, should we be instilling the concept of them being servant leaders, or should we just let them kind of choose whether or not they want to be servant leaders?
Most definitely, but we have to define our terms.
Okay.
I've been lecturing at Morehouse this past semester, and I can imagine this. I've encountered this before. A student comes home and says, well, to mom, what did you learn today, son? Well, I learned about how to be a servant leader. I can see her eyebrows going up like, what? I didn't pay $50,000 for you to be anybody's servant. So what in the world are you talking about? So again, maybe we can invent some new language. It's the language that we have. The people who have written and spoke about it eloquently, Dr. King and others, have used this word service, servant leadership, but maybe we'll come up with some other word, but it does not mean inferior to. There's a nobility implicit in it, in being a servant. And you have to understand that. You have to feel that. Servant leaders are not men and women without egos. They're not selfless. It's just that their number one priority is empowering others. They're just as ego driven as many of us,
Mhm.
but it's not about promoting self.
Well, and I think that that's something that's significant. So, I mean, if we look at
Right.
the history of our people, if we look at it, whether it be in fraternities and sororities, in churches and mosques, among our community, or just like when we think about the Black Women's Club movement, with our people have always like served. That's
Oh,
something that is
most
deeply rooted in
definitely.
the Black experience.
Most definitely. And I understood that, but I didn't have the terminology, the language to explain it. I'll give you a case in point. My first book, The Friends of Freedom, is
Mhm.
about free people of color who, operated the Underground Railroad amidst great persecution, who promoted literacy and founded some of the first schools and colleges for Black folk. They
Mhm.
were servant leaders. They didn't define themselves
Mhm.
as such, but when we look at their behavior and their tactics and their strategies, it was always about promoting the interests of Black folks. That's how we come up with the phrase race men and race women. That
Mhm.
was the most noble vocation that you can have. It was all about the business of uplifting Black folks.
Yes,
And
yes.
they were servant leaders personified.
Yes. And I think about that in terms of like my grandfather. I got to call his name, Paul
Mhm.
Thomas Sr., because I couldn't call like my grandfather was not a radical. Or like my dad would be called a militant, when he was younger. You wouldn't see him like out on the streets, just like loud and protesting and stuff like that. But my grandfather was absolutely a race man. What I
Mhm.
understand about the importance of HBCUs, about serving our community, the difficulties that Black communities had after desegregation, I understand those things because of my grandfather.
Sure, sure.
And my grandfather was an educator, and he was somebody that always served his community and was uncompromising about that, although you wouldn't necessarily label him in the ways that, people might label folks now.
Right.
Or I think the young people, this might date me, I think they say they woke now. That wouldn't necessarily be his term,
Okay.
but he was definitely a race man.
Sure,
Yeah, and he
sure.
was clear about that. He was clear that he was gonna pass that along to me as his granddaughter.
And the people that I write about in my first book
Mhm,
were just ordinary folks. It wasn't like they were out to promote themselves. It was all about survival of the tribe, which has deep cultural roots
mhm,
for us. So when Nat Turner revolts, and the word is that he was literate, he got his
mhm,
inspiration from the Bible. Well, white folks said, well, wait a minute, where did he get a Bible? And more importantly, who taught him how to read?
mhm.
The problem with Nat Turner was that he was not content to strut around the plantation being the smartest guy there. He wanted to empower, enrich, and liberate others. And that's what made him a servant leader.
And I think that that's actually an important concept. I read one of you. I know you did this open letter to the Men of Morehouse this year, and one of the things that you talked about in that letter was you pointed out like Du Bois coining the term "the talented tenth,"
Right.
and then him later on critiquing his commentary around the talented tenth, and then oh, help me out. Who wrote The Miseducation of the Carter G.
Carter G. Woodson, yeah.
I almost
Yeah.
forgot for a second. And Carter G. Woodson critiquing that idea of the talented tenth, recognizing these two men are looking at the Black community and recognizing you got these folks that are smart, but sometimes they get in leadership positions and it's about themselves.
That's
As
precisely
opposed,
right. That's precisely right. So Du Bois comes up with this idea, or he
Mhm,
popularized the term talented tenth in 1903. And then by 1933, Carter G. Woodson comes after and says, wait a minute, the so-called talented temps seems to have lost their way.
mhm,
They're no longer about uplift of the race. They seem to be more about occupying positions of authority
mhm.
and leadership. And what we need to do is flip that again, invert it on his head, and focus more on service as opposed to leadership. And then, oddly enough, 43 years later, after Du Bois postulated his talented tenth theory, He says, wait a minute, guys, I had it wrong. In my idealism, I assumed that the educated Black folks would automatically want to serve their people, and I was wrong. He says, and without that service, they're of no good to us. And